Clay, who was basically the military general who oversaw the Reconstruction, and removed them. And actually, Earhart goes on his weekly radio show and says they're gone, right? And Lucius, what's that?
It was over the weekend.
Yeah, over the weekend when everyone was kind of at home, right? And Lucius Clay calls him. I think I talk about this in my book. I have these quotes. Lucius Clay calls him in his office and says, "Why did you do that? You're not supposed to do anything without my approval." And he said, "I realized why the economy was stagnating, and I knew you wouldn't let me remove these things, so I did it on my own." And that's the kind of thing that we really messed up on. There was also major bureaucracy problems as well there. And so one of the arguments I make is that actually Germany, for instance, was successful despite U.S.'s best efforts to keep it poor through these price controls and bureaucracy. Japan, it was somewhat similar. I mean, the other thing was there was indigenous inclusion of leaders as well. For instance, everyone says MacArthur wrote the Constitution, which he did oversee it, but there was a lot of local people involved in it as well, and it was approved before it was implemented. Now, you can make the point that it was a show that it was approved because basically they were forced to approve it, but nonetheless they did. So from that standpoint, I think at least that helps explain why those were successful. We'll never, at least in the foreseeable future, we won't have any equivalent of Germany or Japan that will be involved in, because none of the problem states, if you want to think about it in that way, that are on our radar. When I say us, I mean the United States or anywhere near level development or similar to them. Yes, sir.
It sounds to me like you had two presentations here. The first part of the presentation is why political economic development won't work, but the second part is here's how to do it and do it better. I mean, so maybe you could clarify that.
Sure. I mean, look, I guess here's the way I start. I start with and this is the way I start my book too. If you think about it, ends and means. The ends I take as given, and the ends I take as basically stated by the people involved in this, which is in these countries they want to establish a market economy, democracy, a legal system which supports those things, and so on. So that's the ends. And then it's a debate over the means, the best means to accomplish those ends. And I think that's where, if I had to kind of summarize the overarching theme of the two presentations, if you want to think about it that way, is that's the common theme. What are the best means? And what I want to argue is the means that are currently employed are not the best means to accomplish the ends. I don't take issue with the ends at all to say they're good or bad. I take those as given. And of course, those are important issues, whether we should be doing it, right, or if we should be involved. But I kind of put those issues aside to focus on what are the most appropriate means. And that's kind of where this comes in at the end. Like, here's some alternative means for accomplishing the same tasks, or the same end, rather, that you want to accomplish.
What are the specific nuances with as far as Reconstruction domestically or like in a post-disaster environment, like with Galveston or New Orleans?
Yeah, I mean, it's very complicated, but a lot of this stuff applies. I mean, Professor D'Amico was involved in a project at the Mercatus Center that looked into a lot of this stuff. But here's, by the way, the book I'm starting this summer is a follow-up to this one. It's called, there's this movement in the international community called the Responsibility to Protect movement. And it's basically this idea that the assumption for a long time has been state sovereignty. You don't intervene in sovereign states unless they pose a threat to you. Well, this new idea is that if sovereign states can't protect their citizens, the international community has a duty, a responsibility to protect them. And again, I'm going to focus on the positive aspect. Can we do it? Can we actually protect them? And here's where, at least right now, my thinking might change on this, but here's where I stand. I think that humanitarian aid is very similar with the road type situation. If we spend lots of money delivering grain to people, we'll get more grain delivery. I don't deny that. It's going to be massively inefficient, but it's going to happen. I can see why people make the argument in the short run with basically people starving. You need to just get them food. You don't really care. They say, look, okay, it's going to be inefficient, but we just got to get these people basic food and water. And I think that's the best we can do. I think there's varying degrees of that. I think, for instance, to the extent you can rely on non-governmental organizations to actually distribute things, it's going to be more likely that people that need them are going to get them. But then you get this second part, which is the actual reconstruction. And here's where I'm very skeptical about the ability of basically USAID and other international organizations to rebuild countries for the same reasons I talked about. And they're going to do it in Haiti. They've already have the plan set up, right? I mean, I don't know if you heard this, but in The Economist a couple weeks ago, and it was not just in The Economist, they had an article about how Paul Collier, who's a development economist at Oxford, had written this plan before the disaster to rebuild Haiti. And they want to set up a development authority. And there's talk about putting Bill Clinton in charge of it. I don't know if you have read this. Bill Clinton would basically be the overseer of the reconstruction of Haiti, which again should strike us as somewhat odd that he's in charge of rebuilding a country, no matter where you lie on the political spectrum. But in terms of what we can do, again, I think what we can do is let people figure out what works best for them. Given that the natural disasters happen, we know that spending lots of money is not a solution. In other words, it's not simply a matter of a technical issue of spending lots of money. The tractors in the story I put up earlier. And even here, right? I mean, spending a lot of money and getting lots of donations is not a solution in itself. What we need to make sure is that people have an incentive to utilize those resources in a manner which will make them better off. And unless we can find ways of doing that, you're not going to get the outcome that you like. But here's the other thing. The other way to get people to solve the problem of natural disasters is move them. In other words, if we know certain places are prone to natural disasters, it's unclear to me why we want to rebuild them, on the face of it. Now, there might be an argument for doing that. But another solution is let people move out of those areas, and then you're less likely to have it happen, right? We also know that wealthier countries rebuild faster than poorer countries. So to the extent we can basically encourage development and prosperity in other countries, it will also help them deal with natural disasters. So a country like Haiti is a very poor country. I mean, right? It's extremely poor. And even down to the most basic things which we take for granted, like their cement, right? I mean, if you read these articles about the buildings collapsing, building materials are terrible because they don't have certain ingredients in cement that you and I take for granted that can stand up to adverse weather. So again, encouraging development through this type of thing is another way to do it.
Yes, you say you have a new book. It's on a different movement that's coming off, in which countries actually are actually involved in the welfare and the protection inside a country.
It's things like, on the face of it, it sounds, I mean, the problem with foreign aid and these humanitarian intervention in general is the proponents have rhetoric on their side. Basically, it's very easy to sound like a bad, like, here's an example. If I said, you look, there's a genocide happening, should we go over there? And you're like, no. It's very easy for you to sound like you don't care about people in the most basic sense when brutal things are happening. But that's like the responsibility to protect. There's genocide happening. There's mass starvation happening. Does the international community have a responsibility to intervene and fix it? That's the responsibility. It's called the responsibility to protect doctrine. And the main critics have actually been like Marxist types, but their arguments are imperialistic ones, that the U.S. Wants to basically, colonize them and take their natural resource type things. But there's a more fundamental argument, which is putting that aside. It may or may not be true. Can we actually do it? And that's the question I think we should be asking.
I'm sorry, is it new? I mean, it sounds like we've been doing it for...
Well, it's new from the standpoint that there's actually a responsibility. If you can come up with a set of what they're trying to do now is come up with a set of actual guidelines under which conditions the United Nations would basically intervene in sovereign countries. We have been doing it, but the funny part is, of course, it's usually been one-off. Like the U.S. would choose to intervene in country X, or some other country would choose to intervene, and then it's very random, which is part of what frustrates people. And typically, what happens is there's other interests involved. There's reasons why we choose to intervene in some countries and not intervene in others. But another reason we should be skeptical of this type of thing is because if we are really committed to helping people. And let's say we could make an argument that at some point it doesn't make sense to use the military. When you fail, and there's evidence of this, citizens for a period of time, there's like a hangover effect where they're very skeptical of military involvement for a period of time. Right with Somalia, for instance, the U.S. failed there very quickly. There's lots of books written on how politicians were very hesitant to use any kind of military for any means, not just for rebuilding, but for humanitarian purposes, because they were so worried about the repercussions at home. And of course, some of those graphic images in Somalia of the U.S. troops being pulled after they had been shot, behind the automobiles and hanging and stuff. That kind of stuff, obviously, for good reason, sticks with people. So there's that to keep in mind as well. There's a cost of failure. And of course, another argument is some kind of thing with figuring out ways for basically privatizing foreign aid. You can send money to organizations you want, and that's a way of aligning incentives to some degree, right? That's like the donor argument, right? You have some kind of check on where you're sending your money. Now, a lot of people send their money and they don't actually look at what the people are doing, but it's some kind of check. We really have no check with our tax dollars. It's not like we get an itemized bill of where our money goes. So that there's a huge disconnect between the consumer, to the extent we're actually consumers of that, and what the producer's actually doing.
So there's going to be a definition difficulty concerning the political economy trap, and I want to clarify.
Sure.
So you got a situation in which we're assuming a sort of concern whether or not X